Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services program to bring you this strategic planning webinar, which is really an introduction to strategic planning. As you may know, the DHPSNY program includes some really great opportunities to support organizations with collections in developing strategic plans, either for their collections or for the entire organization, to include collections, of course. And so this webinar is kind of a great opportunity to share information with you about why strategic planning is important. Usually the folks who participate in these kinds of webinars or training opportunities are those that are kind of most interested. And you can take this information back to your organizations and your boards of directors and catalyze the conversation, and perhaps then consider applying for a grant through DHPSNY to get the strategic planning services. Essentially, it's a services-related grant opportunity. As you probably know, they have a lot of other great training opportunities for you as well. So this is one component of the DHPSNY program. So I'm going to essentially walk you through the process of strategic planning. We'll start off talking about why strategic planning is important, and really about how it relates to what I think is almost more important about the idea of fostering a strategic culture in your organization, and thinking about things differently. And as you know, we live in a very rapidly changing world and environment, and the way things are funded and the way people experience, whether it's sort of an understanding of our history and want to engage in, sort of their understanding of their community and the history, or in terms of arts and culture, people are interacting in the world differently. So we want to make sure that our organizations, stay up to speed in that area. And then what we'll do is really walk you through the planning process. So we'll talk a little bit about making sure it's a good time in your organization by assessing your readiness. You don't want to engage in strategic planning when your organization is going through a crisis. And then once you've kind of built the consensus that this is a good time for strategic planning, you want to think about the process. And we'll talk a little bit about the process that the DHPSNY program uses, but we'll also talk about kind of a general strategic planning process. There's no one size fits all. Some organizations do a very streamlined process. The DHPSNY process is fairly streamlined, but some organizations want to add broader components and stakeholder engagement and financial analysis, and those kinds of things can also be integrated. So we can talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about building your foundation for strategic planning, making sure you're clear on your mission. Of course, that's first and foremost for our organizations. And also the values that you share, and the strategic vision or strategic intent or strategic positioning statement for your organization, essentially developing a picture of where your organization wants to be in the future. And then we'll talk a little bit about conducting an environmental assessment, the SWOT analysis, strengths and weaknesses, which are internal to your organization, and opportunities and threats, which are external to your organization. And we will talk about then, from that SWOT analysis, really looking at the strategic issues that your organization wants to address as part of your planning process. And from there, we'll develop strategic directions in terms of really your big picture goal for each of those strategic issues. Those might be governance, those might be finance, those might be media or marketing, they might be programs. Certainly they should be collections, care, and management as one of them. And then from there, we'll talk about really developing a plan for implementation and evaluation and preparing the organization for ongoing, monitoring of the plan so that it isn't the proverbial strategic plan that sits on the shelf. So as we go through the agenda, you do have the opportunity to ask questions in the chat box. And I would welcome any questions or ideas that you have coming in, and I will try to integrate them into the conversation. It is challenging to do a webinar and not be able to see your faces and engage and ask questions. We want to make sure that we're addressing the issues that are of interest and relevance to you. So by all means, feel free to ask questions, get clarification as part of the webinar. And you will be getting a copy of this presentation after, so if you want to refer to it, you can certainly do so. You can make copies and share it with your fellow board members and staff, so you'll have that when we're finished. So the first thing I just want to say is that, essentially strategic planning is really a way of making better decisions. And part of what we'll talk about is its role in kind of getting everyone on the same page and really helping you, make those better decisions, move forward, develop a broad understanding internally and externally, so that when you move forward, you've got, clear direction and consensus about why you're making the decisions that you're making. I know a lot of people are cynical or skeptical about strategic planning and the value of it. And I think this is important, to really explain to people that, it is about making better decisions. It is about the process. It's definitely about building into the process the commitment to implementing those decisions on an ongoing basis and implementing the strategic plan over time, because you don't want it to be the proverbial plan that sits on the shelf. So when you think about what strategy is, right, it's really thinking about setting an intentional approach that guides and aligns the organization's activities. So the actions, the resources that you prioritize, the resources that you secure, the resources that you allocate to your programs and services and organizational infrastructure, and to the capabilities of the organization, looking at your staff and volunteer resources as well as financial resources in order to achieve a stated goal. So it's really about intentionality. And that's kind of why I think strategic planning is so important, is that you're setting, a clear intention for moving forward. It may or may not be the end all be all. It may be, it's going to certainly require some review and perhaps some revision over time as you gather new information and new ideas. But that essentially it does set an intention and drives and aligns all of your organization's actions. So, sometimes with strategic planning or the lack of strategic planning, organizations, kind of have their own cultures. And so some organizations are kind of very much, well, let's just sort of take a leap of faith and make this happen. You have one leader who kind of makes that happen. Sometimes you have an entire organization that kind of is just willing to leap off a cliff blindly because they're, sort of following a leader, or they're not really thinking about things differently. So, and other organizations, what we find is that they kind of have always done things that way, that they just kind of keep with the strategy and they don't renew or revise what they've done. And so they get stale, right? And so, I think that's a really important thing, especially around audience engagement and audience diversification, is that if we keep trying to engage with audiences or constituents or, visitors or members, they're not going to necessarily be interest. We're going to see a decline in our participation. So we need to make sure we keep things fresh. And some organizations that may be dealing with major challenges, whether they're financial challenges or sort of marketplace challenges in terms of attendance or visibility or visitation, they just stick their head in the sand and they don't really, think about kind of the environment. And they just kind of keep doing what they've always done, but they're not paying attention. And one other sort of strategy is kind of the wobble, right? Where people don't make decisions. They don't know how to make decisions. And so their teamwork, their collaboration, is sort of, they have devised maybe perhaps different perspectives on the board. And so they go back and forth, but they're not able to be decisive. And I think that's also a strategy that you want to avoid. Sometimes it's better to take a calculated risk or a calculated leap of faith than it is to just stay stuck and not really act at all. And that's the wobble. So a strategic planning is really an important tool, right? First and foremost, it is an internal tool. The process itself can build unity and stability within the organization. It can really help to inspire people and organize kind of board and committee staff and volunteers in aligning your focus and in moving forward in the same direction. So it's a team building opportunity that really helps get people, sharing ideas, and allowing you to think creatively, right? To sort of think strategically, to think out of the box, and to really think about how you manage change proactively rather than reactively. And, as organizations that are, busy putting on programs, or, boards that are busy kind of doing governance work, they don't always have the time to stop and take a step back and think about what they're doing and bring together a more diversified team to really think creatively. So strategic planning provides that opportunity to do that and to engage people in different ways. Strategic plan, once you've developed it, can also serve as a monitoring tool. And so it allows the board and the staff to, align your priorities and hold the organization accountable, both at the board level and at the staff level, for agreed upon, strategies and directions for all of your goals and actions and outcomes. It becomes a reference tool. So, when we talk about building accountability, it gives you a framework for communication and for having kind of a shared set of priorities from which everybody is acting and towards which, goals which everybody is focused. And then it's an external tool, right? So it can be used to attract funders or board members, or perhaps staff and volunteers, other consumers or visitors, and other resources. I just want to be clear that a strategic plan is fundamentally an internal document, and it differs from a business plan in that sense. A business plan, certainly can look at the viability of a particular program or product or service, but it is designed often as an external tool to attract resources or investment. So what I would say is, when you're thinking about developing your strategic plan, you develop the plan for your internal use, and then you can kind of extract from it the components of the planning process that you want to share publicly. You may not want to share your organization's weaknesses publicly, but that's an important conversation for board members and staff to understand as you're kind of building on the strategic plan and moving forward and working to really, make organizational change and improvements and build capacity over time. So it's a good reference point. So, just in terms of really thinking about how strategy and thinking strategically can help the organization. Some organizations are kind of more in crisis management mode than in proactive strategy and decision making. And so part of what you're trying to avoid is constantly having to do damage control after the fact, because if you're strategic, you've put into place policies and procedures and sort of risk management and thought so that you're not getting to the point of having to do damage control. Certainly there are times when things are just out of our control, but it's better to kind of be as proactive as you can in that. You certainly want to avoid organizations, right, meeting on an emergency basis, or having to plan special meetings because there's critical issues that need resolution, between meetings. So it's not being reactive to emergencies. It's just kind of being more proactive and thinking about things, again, from policies on down in terms of risk management and program development. A lot of organizations kind of put off those governance tasks, or financial planning, financial oversight, cash flow analysis, making sure that you're in compliance with your charter or with the Nonprofit Revitalization Act. Because, governance isn't fun in and of itself. And other things that might feel more pressing or more timely are likely to take precedence. But I think that's what gets organizations into crisis mode. And also, when you're not really looking outside at the environment, so you're not aware of changing external circumstances that might, impact your organization. And whether that's financial, and looking at the local economy, or looking at competition, or looking at, sort of your ability to attract board members with the expertise that you need, really thinking about, what's going on externally as well as internally. And then, the sort of managing crisis component of things often causes organizations to be unable to really influence and drive the impact that those external circumstances have on the organization, so that they become reactive and responsive rather than proactive and strategic. So, part of what we want to learn how to do at the board and certainly management level is to manage that change. And that's always a learning process. Part of it is creating a learning culture. But are you being proactive about preparing for possible negative outcomes when you're thinking about actions, looking at the ramifications of what decisions might be made? And those can be positive decisions in terms of, establishing a new program or revising your existing program delivery model. And it can also be financial decisions if you need to cut staff or you need to make serious changes. Those actions, the implications of those actions should be considered as well. Are you being proactive in keeping your policies and procedures up to date? Many organizations are struggling with the increase in minimum wage or the change in salary threshold between non-exempt and exempt employees. And, things like that can, if you're not keeping your policies up to date, you can really get into trouble. You need to be able to monitor the impact of paid family leave and what might that mean for your organization. How do you cover the increased costs along with growing minimum wage? So really being strategic and thinking about those kinds of things and your benefits and your policies, especially at the staff level. Do you look at those environmental trends and challenges that may affect you, and what's going on in the world in which you're providing services? And, I think that the DHPSNY program is trying to really help organizations, particularly around, digitalization and really collections care and management, and new ways and new strategies of keeping up to date with things, especially given the challenge around storage management and really making sure that your archives and collections are properly stored. And then, do you want to maximize the influence that these trends or challenges are having on the organization? So again, just in terms of, you're never going to be able to control the external environment, but by staying clear and understanding them and looking at the finances or the marketplace or the staff or board environment, you can get a better sense of what decisions you need to make. And then the other thing is also thinking not just, day to day, week to week, year to year, but really thinking longer term about where you're headed and how what you do today and tomorrow is going to affect what you do next month and next year and, over the next few years. Particularly things like facilities. And if you're building a new facilities or making major facilities investments, are you thinking about things like cash flow management, about revenue, about how you're going to sustain those increased, sort of capital expenses? So again, part of what strategic planning is and does is really helps you better manage change and be aware of the environment in which you're operating. So ultimately, when we're talking about strategic planning, we're talking about the development, right, and ultimately the implementation. And one of the things I just want to stress from the beginning is to commit to implementing your plan, to commit to thinking of it as a tool that will drive and prioritize organizational decision-making and actions. So you're developing and implementing a plan with informed strategies. The informed part, again, goes back to really understanding your internal capacity, your strengths and weaknesses, as well as the external environment, opportunities and threats, stakeholders, partnerships, funders, right? That connect present circumstances, right? In terms of what is your capacity now? What are you doing well? Where are you challenged? With your vision for the future. And so this is kind of a vision of that, right? Essentially, what you're trying to do is develop an understanding of your present situation and circumstances and developing the vision for the future, and then really looking at strategies and accountabilities for how you're going to accomplish that vision or that strategic intent. When we think about what strategic organizations are, and this goes back to really thinking about your plan and your planning process and how these things get aligned, is that you develop a shared mission, values, and vision. That platform and that framework is really, shared, that there's clarity, that people understand what is meant by your mission, that people interpret the words and the language and the intent in the same way, that the shared values can help you drive decision-making, particularly in challenging times. And again, that your vision is clear and that people know where you're headed so that everybody is aligned and working in the same direction. Right. One of the things that's really important to think about is effective communication, that you think from a systems perspective within your organization, at the board level, at the staff level, at the volunteer level, at your consumer or visitor level, your audience, receiving audience input that creates feedback loops that helps you better understand and design your programs and services. So that whole system is really an integrated one, and there's a feedback loop, and people are on the same page about both the intent, but also the impact of that intent and whether you're in fact achieving the same goals that you wanted to accomplish. One component that's really important about strategic organizations is to make sure that you have that respected and proactive leadership. That certainly, at the board level, that you have a solid board team that is, respected in the community, that is respected by staff, that if you do have staff, that your, executive director or your artistic director or your curator, that they are respected and proactive, and that they're thought of, as innovators and really, relevant, providing relevant leadership and programming to the community. And then, as I said before, that there's a commitment to learning, both at the organizational level and at the individual level. So organizationally, making sure that you're providing board and staff with educational opportunities, with sharing opportunities, and that individuals are also committed to their ongoing professional development in various areas of expertise. So part of it is just working to create a more proactive and strategic organization. And I think one of the things that strategic planning does is helps us move forward in this, direction. So some of the best practices that we're seeing is, again, creating the strategic thinking and culture. The strategic plan is a living and breathing document, right? It's not a document that sits on the shelf. It's not something that is written in stone. That you start, you develop a process, you develop a plan, and then you can always modify it if you need to. But essentially what you do is you come back to center and you say, this is an opportunity that we didn't know existed. If we do move forward with this opportunity, it means that the things we identified in our plan, may need to be rethought. Are we comfortable with that? And so it just gives everybody a framework and a context for driving decision making, and also helps in prioritizing annual work plans and annual budgets. Used to be organizations would develop a strategic plan, a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan. They might take a couple of years to do that. What we're seeing now is that the environment is changing so rapidly. That's not realistic anymore. So usually what we're seeing is a 3 to 5 year vision. So that if you're developing a strategic plan every 3 years, your process should certainly be shorter. And typically what we do in working with organizations is to think about a 4 to 6 month process from start to finish. And then you have a 3-year plan. And some processes are shorter than that, and some may be a little bit longer, just in terms of the scope of your planning process or the size of the organization. But again, you want to make it kind of a catalyst for driving organizational decision making, and don't get lost essentially in trying to make all of the decisions as part of your strategic plan. So, you need to develop a broad strategic plan, but not also develop a fund development plan or a marketing plan. You just need to acknowledge that one of the things that you need to do over the course of your implementing your strategic plan, is to develop those other sub-plans. We strongly encourage board involvement and ownership. In part, that's to align resources and priorities. Certainly, staff can play an important role in developing the strategic plan, but there really needs to be leadership and ownership at the board level in order to make sure that there's accountability, and that there is really systems thinking, and that when board members are going out to secure resources with you, that they do have buy-in to the plan and the planning process. So, another component that organizations are dealing with is really an increased emphasis on self-sufficiency, on maintaining kind of maneuverability, on not being overly reliant on grant funding that really provides restricted revenue. Many organizations are looking at ramping up their earned income or ramping up contributed income so that they do have flexibility in terms of, being more sustainable, and also being able to really, just drive the programming that they want to put into place, rather than have that driven by funders or even large donors. One other area that I think is really challenging for organizations, and this is particularly true when organizations are dealing with challenging financial times, is distinguishing core from secondary activities. There are some programs that we do because they are fundamental to our mission, but there are sometimes programs that we do that are kind of nice. They might be community building programs, but they're not necessarily core mission related activities. And I think, part of it is just getting clear on those. Part of it is really doing an analysis to determine the benefits and the values of those secondary mission activities. If they're supporting member engagement and donor engagement, that might be valuable. But if they ultimately are costing you more money than they're bringing into the organization at the expense of some of your core programs or services, you really need to take a second look at that. You can't kind of maintain the sacred cows just because that a particular board member or a particular staff member likes certain activities. You really need to evaluate, why you're doing things and the ultimate value that it brings to your organization. There's a greater reliance on kind of making sure that you have evaluation tools as part of your strategic planning process, that you've got, either measurable or verifiable results or outcomes, right? So they're not always quantifiable, but they should be certainly qualitatively verifiable, that you are moving forward and you can communicate progress. As I mentioned before, it's not the end-all be-all, so it serves as an umbrella plan for other kinds of plans, whether they're fund development or marketing or program plans. The strategic plan kind of helps you align your priorities and resources and to determine how you're going to deploy your board and your staff, team and financial resources and human resources in order to get all of those other activities completed. We also, are seeing, nonprofits really looking at the reality of competition, and that it can be highly competitive, both for funding, but also for audience members, for board members, for qualified staff. So part of what we need to do as part of the strategic planning process is to really look at our core capacity, our core expertise, and really leverage that so that we can voice that in a competitive marketplace, a competitive environment. And then finally, what we want to do is really look at, substantive collaboration and restructuring opportunities. We're seeing organizations partner, right? Whether it's regional partnerships to build, a sort of more of a tourism industry around museums and historical sites, or looking at, how organizations like Lakes to Locks, bringing organizations together to tell a story about a region or community or our history so that there's a connection. But other organizations are also looking at, and this is a little more complicated with chartered organizations, but really, looking at shared services agreement and having shared staffing, or looking at mergers and collaborations as a possible way of leveraging resources, and also expanding audience members. So it's something that many organizations are thinking about for sustainability and viability. So as we think about moving into the planning process, you want to first work with your organization to assess your readiness to plan. Is it a good time for you to think about this? You want to make sure you've got both, board leadership and executive director support. And if there is resistance or skepticism, address it early on. Include those skeptics, on a planning committee to help make sure, if you do decide that you're moving forward with this, to make sure that their concerns are addressed. And sometimes you need to move forward and plow forward through that skepticism. You want to, educate people and engage them to the best of your ability. Is there leadership for the planning process? So will the executive director drive it? Will the board chair or a committee chair drive the planning process within the organization? Do they have the knowledge to move forward? Do you have the expertise that you need to move forward? Do you have people who understand what it is, or do you need to think about getting a consultant to help you, whether it's, to help spearhead the entire process or simply to help kind of provide objective facilitation during the retreat or planning process? Do you have the resources? So it does take financial resources. Again, planning can be kind of a very streamlined process, or it can be relatively robust. You just need to make sure that you've got the resources, that you can allocate them, and that you really align the planning process with your available resources, both in terms of human resources and financial resources. You want to think about when it makes sense for you to do strategic planning in your organization. So, do you want to do a plan and have it kind of ready in preparation for your next fiscal year's budget cycle, right? So it can inform and advise it. And if you have a calendar year budget, then maybe you want to think about finishing your planning process, by September or October, so that it can inform the next year's budget. Do you have the information or data that you need? Do you have what you need from your own reports, your program reports, your grant reports, knowing about your audiences? Are you looking at benchmarking audience, and event participation from year to year? And is that an important strategic issue? In which case, do you want to wait until after your busy summer season so that you've got, comparative year to year and the most recent data? Do you need to get cultural data project data, those kinds of things? So just think about what information you might need. You want to make sure that, you have a history of successful committee or collaborative work. That certainly strategic planning can help catalyze that. It can help catalyze a revitalization of board committees or organizational structure. But it does require organizations to really kind of, have the ability to work in smaller groups often. So that might be something to think about, and how you, invest in that knowledge and practice. And then you also want to make sure that you're not dealing with a major crisis or a major transition. You don't want to do strategic planning right in the middle of an when your executive director is about to leave, or you just lost a major funding, a major funder. You might need to do some sort of short-term crisis planning, but strategic planning, long-term strategic planning probably isn't a good thing to do while you're in organizational crisis. So once you've kind of built your consensus that yes, in fact, we want to do strategic planning, you want to think about designing the process. So you really want to engage in some conversations. I would suggest that having a strategic planning committee is a good start. It's probably, important to think about board. We would suggest that you have board leadership for the process, to include your staff leadership if you've got staff. You can include volunteers. You can include, other folks from the community, partners. But again, I think you don't want a huge committee. I would say probably, no more than 5 or 6 people to spearhead the process. You want to identify the goals. What do you want to accomplish? What's your general sense of what role the plan will play in your organization, how you're going to use it, what you want to get out of it? If you're doing it yourself, you want to make sure from the beginning that you have a facilitator who can really provide, some objective guidance, and that won't, steer the conversation in their direction, or just someone who, doesn't really have strong facilitation skills, so that you get caught up in process and don't move forward into decision making. And definitely having an outside facilitator is important. You know, certainly if you're thinking about applying for the DHPSNY program, you will get someone who can help facilitate the process. Some organizations have, you know, gotten volunteer facilitators from a university or somebody who's, you know, not on the board. And I think having someone who's not on the board or staff do it is just fundamentally important. You want to think about the major activities and products. So what, you know, what are you hoping to kind of do in terms of the plan process? And then what do you want to get out of it? Do you actually want a document? Do you want a work plan? Do you want something that will really drive decision making, or you know, an implementation, or do you want a broad kind of more of a strategic directions plan? What I would suggest is that you develop an action plan for the implementation of the planning process, right? So you build consensus, you talk about timeframes, human resource needs, funding needs, and so you kind of just write that down and everybody's on the same page about that. And then you kind of clarify the roles of the committee chair and director, you know, of your consultant, of your staff, again, ideally in writing, so everybody knows who's accountable for what and accountable to whom and in what ways. You know, you sort of think through the plan document, as I mentioned earlier, and then you think about the timeline, whether it's, you know, a 5-year vision with a 3-year action plan, or whether you're talking about a 3-year vision, you know, with a 2 or 3-year action plan. You just want to think those things through and think about what you're hoping to accomplish and what you want to get out of it and what the process itself should include. So typically, you know, this is just a visual of what this could look like. You design it. Once you jump into the planning process, right, you want to either develop or affirm your mission and your values. You want to think ahead about the vision. You want to develop your you know, environmental scans, so your external opportunities and threats and your internal strengths and weaknesses. You want to then begin to kind of, from that analysis, you're going to begin to see and identify the strategic issues, and we'll talk more about what those might be in a few minutes. And then you'll develop strategies and accountabilities. You'll reassess and clarify and prioritize. You know, you'll finalize the plan. So basically, you know, there's a review and a revision and an affirmation that what you initially thought of as, you know, your top priorities, as you go through the planning process, you revisit that and verify along the way that, yes, this all makes sense, it ties together. And then you begin to implement the plan, and you hopefully over time evaluate, you know, what you're doing, and you can change it. And this is where you know, sometimes you'll see these stars on the side here, and essentially there's a feedback loop. So, you know, typically you might go back and reassess your SWOT analysis. The environment changes, your capacity changes. A critical staff member leaves. You need to reevaluate what is, you know, actually capable, what you're capable of accomplishing, and in what time frame. So the planning process, you know, sort of has the plan development itself has a final point, but then the planning process kind of continues through implementation and monitoring and evaluation. So, you know, I just want to give you a more tangible sense of what a typical planning process looks like. This approach generally follows what the DHPSNY process is, except that the DHPSNY process, instead of having a strategic planning committee that meets 3 to 5 times with the facilitator, they tend to meet 1 or 2 times with the facilitator, and then need to meet kind of another couple of times internally on their own. So the process itself is the same, but it's just our role is a little bit different. So typically what we do is the first meeting of the strategic planning committee really is developing a plan to plan, right? You agree on the information that you need. The process, that we use, and we'll talk about that, is a survey, but some organizations include other kinds of data. The second meeting, what you do is really kind of review the data, identify your priorities, sort of come out with a retreat agenda. Right? So you want to kind of frame the issues, frame your priorities, and really then develop a retreat agenda that reflects kind of people's ability and time to contribute, to participate, to attend. And then, in the meetings post-retreat, you kind of review the original results from the retreat. And often what we do is provide a draft strategic plan, that enables the group to kind of focus and review and revise. My experience is that if you are self-facilitating a planning process, the process piece is less efficient, and it typically takes more meetings and more time to move forward. It's just kind of because there's a lot of people participating. There's not one person kind of driving the process who may or may not have a lot of experience. People may or may not know how to develop a strategic plan. It's hard to write by committee. So just be aware that doing it yourself, is fine, but it may be much more time intensive. When we talk about the data collection, what we typically do is an online survey of board and staff members. And we use SurveyMonkey, but what we do is kind of get everybody to start thinking about the plan and start thinking about the planning process. So we get people to provide some input on the mission and values. Are these still accurate? Do they still provide, solid guidance, right? One of the things that you need to do as a chartered organization is to review your mission every 5 years, and this is certainly an important step in that. But you don't have to change it, but it's really, again, important to build that foundation. We ask people to think about, where do you envision the organization 3 to 5 years from now, from a strategic positioning statement? How will it be different? What changes will you make? And just, again, get people to start thinking about these issues early on. We ask people to weigh in on the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. That's the SWOT analysis. And then we ask for input on goals, right? So where do you see the organization moving forward? What are your suggestions for how we address collections care management or board development or resource development or marketing? And then one of the areas that we particularly at NYCON suggest doing is really doing a board self-assessment and looking at, what the board's sort of strengths and weaknesses and knowledge and satisfaction are, because, board effectiveness is so critically tied to organizational effectiveness. But some organizations choose not to do that, but it is a good step in the process. Some organizations really want to get stakeholder or member input, right? So they might do a survey of their members, typically a much shorter one than what we do with staff and board members. Or they might interview or have a consultant interview some of your key donors or your partners, really identifying some, very select folks to do one-on-one key informant interviews with. Some organizations do focus groups or community meetings as a way of getting input. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for doing this. One is, it certainly may be helpful, particularly if you feel like your audience is changing or you don't do this kind of data collection on a regular basis. I think it's also valuable from a strategic marketing perspective, in the sense that you you go out to your stakeholders and you say, this is where we're headed. This is what we're thinking. We'd love to get your input on our priorities. Tell us what you'd like to see. And then you collect that information, you digest it, and then after you've developed the plan, you can go back to people and say, thank you so much for your input. Based on your recommendations, these are the decisions we've made, and this is where we're heading. And we'd love your, financial and other volunteer support in making this happen. So there's kind of a strategic element to ongoing stakeholder input. It's definitely not necessary as part of the planning process, particularly if you have a kind of an evaluation process or ongoing member engagement, but it can be helpful. And then you want to think about what other data you want to look at. Are you looking at financial data, program data, attendance trends? Are you benchmarking against other organizations who might complete the cultural data project? So you just want to kind of think about, what other information will help inform your decision making. So, the committee essentially does the digesting of the preliminary data. I do think it's important to share that information with all of the people who are attending your retreat in advance. What I would say is, a planning retreat can be either a full day or a part day. Some organizations have several shorter meetings. Some sort of involve just the board. Some involve board and staff. Some have an additional separate, they might have the board and staff leadership if it's a larger organization. Some organizations have a separate session just for staff if they do have a larger staff. And what we typically do as an organization, and certainly as this is through the DHPSNY program, is develop kind of a PowerPoint summary of all of the data points, of the high-level data points to focus the meeting, so that you're not looking at a 20-page survey report. You're looking at key themes, and then essentially summarize the retreat notes after the retreat. And then draft a strategic plan and work with the committee to finalize that. And then the committee would bring that plan back to the board for final board approval. And then, of course, implementation begins. So that's kind of our typical planning process. There's no one size fits all. Some organizations do a much more streamlined process where all they do is a retreat. And coming out of the retreat, they've identified some action steps, and that's perfectly fine too. Again, it goes back to really looking at your overall goals and the scale of the planning process. So just to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive, the mission is really about why you exist, not how, right? So it's about the overarching ends of what you're trying to accomplish, but not necessarily how you're going to accomplish that. You don't need to sort of articulate all of the different programs and services that you offer, because those might change, right? So you don't have to say, we have a museum, but we also offer video and we offer online, and you really want to get at kind of why you're doing things. It should be inspiring. It should be a powerful statement. I kind of think of it like a pledge of allegiance, right? We're kind of seeing organizations moving away from longer statements to kind of a shorter statement. One thing I just want to, say is that, it should be relatively free of jargon. It should be easy to repeat and understand. It should be motivating. You can also then, if you want to get more detailed, follow up with, we do this by, right? So that's where you talk about how you do things. It's not what you have to include in a grant report or a grant application that we're talking about. It's really about, why you exist. And then, you want to make sure that any changes that you make to the mission are really aligned with the purposes that you've defined in your articles of incorporation or your charter. If if you're changing your mission drastically and it's outside of what's in your charter, you do need to make a legal modification. If all you're doing is changing the wording to kind of paraphrase what's already in your charter, then you wouldn't likely have to make a formal modification of your charter document. And then your vision, right? So really your strategic intent, where are you heading? How will you be different? So it often starts with things, we will be widely known as the, leading expert on information in XYZ County, about the history and culture, over time or something. So it's just a positioning statement. It can talk about the people or community you serve. It can talk about your resources. It can talk about your partnerships. It's really about your strategic intent and providing a vision of the future, a picture of the future. It's not, peace on earth, end of war and poverty. It's really about the strategic intent for your organization. And then the values are about, the culture of the organization, what you believe about what you do. They shape your actions. They can drive policy. There's no one size fits all. There's no legal requirements for value statements. Some organizations just have 3 or 5 words. And again, you don't want a laundry list, right? So you might have integrity, innovation, and partnership, right? And then you can either define what you mean or put them into sentences or develop a paragraph. There's no one size fits all. It's really about how you tell the story about your organization's culture and values. And then the next step in the process is the assessment, right? So the internal assessment that looks at your strengths and weaknesses. It looks at your finances, your administration, your infrastructure, your facilities, your governing body, your organizational capacity, your staff expertise, your volunteer management or engagement, your funding stability. And then externally, you want to look at obstacles. You want to look at, opportunities and threats or obstacles. Some people don't like threats. They don't like that word. So you can think about obstacles. But you want to think about it from the funding and regulatory environment, right? What's happening in terms of, if you get funding from NEA, what's that going to look like over the next few years? What is funding in New York State looking like? Are you comfortable? Are you feeling safe about that? What about your foundations? What's going on? And obviously, since the sort of economic crash, a lot of organizations really had to do some retrenching and strategizing about funding and stability, and things are a little bit getting rebuilt right now. But still, we need to really monitor that. We live in an increasingly regulatory environment. Are we able to sort of stay up to speed? Do we have risks and liabilities in terms of the need to transition our staff from, sort of 1023 contract consultants to paid staff, given changes in labor laws, those kinds of things. We want to look at some of our partners or some of our competitors and what opportunities or concerns we might have there. Looking at program opportunities, what we want to do, how we want to grow, how we want to increase or diversify our audiences. Looking at, is our community changing? Are the people who are interested in us changing? Are people wanting to engage in us differently? Engage with us differently? Do we really need to build in technology as part of how we provide our services? And then also things like, market and stakeholder perception and awareness. If people don't know about you, if your organization isn't, recognized in the marketplace, then attendance and donations are going to suffer. Your ability to attract, board members and volunteers will suffer. So kind of just really looking internally and externally to get a snapshot. And this is just an example, a summary of one organization. And essentially, what it does is sort of gives you a tool for beginning the process of identifying core strategic issues, right? So if an organization has aging facilities and its competition has updated and new facilities, certainly dealing with facilities is going to be a strategic issue. But if you're dealing with, your tenured executive director leaving, you're going to need to sort of look at, succession planning. You're going to need to look at staffing diversification. You might want to think about, partnership. There's possible strategic alliances or partnerships as an opportunity. So maybe as you're thinking about your executive director leaving, maybe you want to create a strategic partnership where you share an executive director with another organization. So part of this is really just doing an analysis based on your organization, based on, what goals you've established, what your vision is. And then from there, you kind of identify the strategic issues that you want to include in your plan. And part of the thing about what makes issues strategic is that they cut across program and administrative lines, and they're complex, right? So they kind of transcend the routine budgeting or day-to-day management or committee process, that they're integrated. So they might include issues that are both financial and program related and board related and funding related. So this analysis and the identification of these issues, recognizing that they are cross-cutting, that they do affect multiple areas, right? So some of the areas that organizations tend to look at, we strongly suggest governance being part of that, or board development, whatever you want to call it. And certainly as part of the DHPSNY program, collections care and care, collections care management is really important. So those would be ones that are fundamental and core to many of your missions. But then, for other organizations, again, it could be leadership and management, or it could be human resources, could be more broadly programs and services. For some organizations, they're dealing with, information systems and technology. I would say that most strategic plans look at financial resource development, and so and communications and marketing as well, right? So these are just, usually there's 4 to 5 strategic issues, and they'll get framed based on your analysis, your SWOT analysis, and based on your vision and where you're hoping to accomplish, what you're hoping to accomplish. And so these are just some examples, right? So strategic issue, and these are just from other organizations. Mission impact and service delivery, right? So they want to enhance the organization's ability to maximize audience engagement and facilities usage by effectively and succinctly communicating the uniqueness, value, and quality of our programming. So that's kind of their strategy or goal for that issue. Or governance. The board will provide the leadership support and skills needed to serve as effective stewards of the organization, right? So perhaps this organization was having some challenges around governance or board engagement. Or resource development. Engage effectively and proactively with stakeholders to raise funds and build the partnerships needed for expanded impact. Or something like organizational capacity and infrastructure, enhancing your internal capacity to support program growth and expansion. So, these are just some examples. There's no one size fits all. There's no right or wrong. And essentially, you know, what you do in developing those strategic issues and your broad goals is essentially prepare for ongoing, you know, implementation. So part of it is to develop and of course monitor an action plan. You want to further develop the responsible parties, who's going to do it, what board, you know, body or committee body is going to oversee it, where's the checks and balances and accountability component. You want to establish your measurable or verifiable objectives, you know, creating those accountability mechanisms. You want to think and build into your strategic plan, you know, how are you going to update and review and revise and calendar, you know, implementation and monitoring. You can think about how you're going to integrate kind of your goals and objectives onto your board and committee agendas or staff meeting agendas. So you want to develop and then maintain some kind of a tracking system. You want to think about ongoing the strategic, you know, thinking and building that into your organization that we talked about earlier. So how new information or changing circumstances affect your plan and your assumptions and the trends, right? So you don't want to avoid looking at the new information, and you don't want to fear having to take a second look at the decisions that were already made. Overall, right, your strategic plan is a great tool and resource for using for evaluating your executive director, because you really look at evaluation as to what extent, you know, is the executive director being successful in moving forward towards, you know, the organization's goals and those goals being agreed to by the board of directors. And then, of course, you know, you revise the plan as necessary. So thinking about, you know, implementation, this is just one example. Usually the strategic direction and the goal will have, you know, several strategies associated with it. So this is one, along with each of those strategies having several actions or tactics. And you know, different organizations use different language. Don't get caught up in whether it's a goal or an objective or a strategy or a tactic or an action. I tend to use goal in the, you know, the goal for the strategic directions of governance. The board will provide leadership support and skills necessary to serve as effective stewards, right? And then one of the strategies is to foster a culture of stewardship and enhance the board's ability to be effective fundraiser and ambassadors for the organization. So then thinking about, well, how are they going to do that? They're going to start by redefining board expectations and fund development to support established goals, including whether and how to raise, give, or get expectations, right? And that'll be done by the fund development committee in the first quarter of 2017. And then, you know, they're going to provide training and support to board members for all aspects of fundraising and marketing goals. And they're going to do that through the committee, but they're also going to need a consultant. And one other option is, after that time frame component, is to have a resources category. So a consultant may be in that resource category, and then maybe, you know, capacity building grant funding or $5,000 might also be identified as part of that. And so then you see that they've calendared the time frame for that. And then, you know, another action that they've got is to prepare board members to be effective ambassadors by developing tools and resources to build their knowledge, familiarity, and comfort. So again, that in this case is a fund development component, committee component. So you see that you kind of have a work plan, and then, you know, obviously you would have other strategies, other goals and strategies. So you might have programs and services as one of the strategic directions. And the responsibility factor would then go to the executive director, you know, or you might have, you know, sort of infrastructure and operational goals that might be the responsibility of your finance committee, or governance board development goals, looking at, being responsible by a board development committee. And one of the things that, ultimately you can do is really think about calendaring each of these, activities for each committee, and then integrating it into the committee work plan or the overall agency work plan, and really using it as a monitoring tool. You can also add a column after time frame that, is for each quarterly update or semi-annual update. So perhaps you are going to provide training and support, but you also want to continue that into 2018. So you can kind of add a column saying, we did training on X, Y, and Z, but the board decided that it needed additional support around the marketing goals, and there will be an additional training scheduled. So some of the challenges that organizations face around the planning process is a lack of commitment and ownership, that you didn't get that from the very beginning, and that you didn't really maintain it through an implementation plan, that you didn't develop any monitoring tools or process, that you don't have clear responsibilities for people. Some organizations have a fear of accountability, right? So they're uncomfortable holding others accountable, or they're uncomfortable being held accountable. And that really is probably a good thing around strategic planning, to think about how to build a culture of accountability. Some organizations are so overwhelmed because what they've done is front load everything in that timeline in the strategic plan. So part of the conversation at the time frame level here is to do a final review to make sure that when you look at each action or strategy as a whole within the entire plan, you're not putting so much in 2017 that you're gonna not be able to accomplish that. And most organizations front load a lot. And so we have to go back and then say, realistically, is this feasible? Let's think about what we want to move to 2018, so that we're not overwhelming ourselves and not setting ourselves up for failure. That organizations kind of return to business as usual and ignore the fact that they have the strategic plan, or they just kind of done what they've done all along. And another challenge is not really having or investing in creating a formal or effective committee structure. So that's certainly something you want to think about, particularly, for those responsibilities that are on the board side. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is create strategic alignment, so that essentially all of the activities emerge from the plan and serve as a reference point. So you see the yellow, brick road, the yellow path here. There's many different ways of getting there, but you need to really make sure that all lines kind of focus on that yellow brick road. And ultimately, you use strategic planning for your board agendas, your committee agendas, for really prioritizing and budget resource allocation. Again, for evaluating your executive director and staff. So you're aligning the organization. And that's really one of the important things that strategic planning does, is builds buy-in, it builds commitment. So when people start saying, oh, we could do X or we could do Y, then the conversation is, well, how does that support what we've got in our strategic plan? And you're not just throwing out ideas all the time, but that you're really thinking about them in a focused and strategic way. Like the way that one spreads through. So ultimately, you also can create a reporting flow chart within your organization. So this is based on an organization that does in fact have staff. Some of you that don't would probably have to redesign it a little bit, but that the staff kind of work through and communicate to the executive director, who reports to the board. And actually these arrows should all probably be, two-way arrows. But that you really kind of look at things and you report on a regular basis around, and you can establish the flow of that, the timing of that reporting. But really looking at accomplishments and challenges, identifying strategies for problem solving and revising of work plans, the identification of new issues, what's going on in the field or in your programs or with your funders, those kinds of things. And then really looking at what are, suggestions for changing the plan, and kind of the also, are there new policies that might be needed and new resources? So you create kind of an ongoing dynamic that supports the implementation of the plan. So in summary, I just want to say that there's not really one model of strategic planning. What I think is important is making it as efficient and effective as possible and not getting lost in the process. That you really want to balance process and product. And so setting the intention from the very beginning is very important, particularly when you're self-facilitating. Both can be simple or can be very sophisticated. We really don't find that a sort of 60-page strategic plan is very helpful for organizations. It's overwhelming, right? So 6 to 10-page document, give or take, that articulates the process and the context and essentially the action plan is really the most valuable. And then you can include reference to all of the materials that you collected and developed as part of informing the development of the strategic plan, the survey or data, interview, summaries, those kinds of things. You want to make sure that you're distinguishing between fix-it issues, right? So, there's a difference between Jane's computer is very old and not working well, and she's having her issues with, broadly speaking, we really need to look at developing a comprehensive technology management plan, right? Or you want to make sure you're not getting lost in, if you're in crisis mode or survival mode, you want to, address those separately so that you can really look at, advancing the organization. And sometimes strategic plans are not about all of the things you're going to do differently, but about how you're going to do what you do more effectively, more efficiently, how to better communicate, how to enhance what you're already doing. Sometimes they're even about retrenchment. So it doesn't mean that you have to come up with some big new bright idea as part of your plan. It's just really a way of getting everyone on the same page about, what you need to do to be as effective and efficient and, sort of strong of an organization as you can. You want to sort of make sure that you're not getting lost in the weeds, that you really want to focus on big picture kinds of issues, that you want to figure out a strategy for integrating how, the bugs on the leaves on the trees address the forest, and have your strategic plan looking at the forest rather than each of the bugs on the leaves on the trees. You want to make your plan doable. You don't want to set yourselves up for failure. You want to really think about getting your team together to set up a shared goal that is a bit of a stretch with really, everyone working collaboratively, but that you can really feel you can accomplish. And you also want to make sure that you don't sugarcoat issues and avoid dealing with, the elephant in the room, the challenging board dynamics, or the events that are no longer effective, or the programs that really don't have much market resonance. So you really want to be able to sort of address and deal with those, challenging dynamics in your organization if they exist. So in summary, developing a plan is really only the starting point. The planning process is important in and of itself, but ultimately it's really the success will come in monitoring your implementation and really looking strategically at how you align the organization and keep everyone moving forward collaboratively. And of course, don't be afraid to change the plan, to review it and revise it, and that should be a natural part of the communication process and ongoing alignment of your organization. So I would welcome any questions or discussion if you want to, either type into the Q&A, or I'm not sure if we could unmute people, but I would welcome any input that you have, questions, follow up. And as I said earlier, you will be getting a copy of the presentation, and I'm sure that you can speak to DHPSNY staff about if you're interested in participating in the strategic planning program. They can share with you the application and all of that information for the next round of the program. I don't know if Anastasia or Jason want to add any final comments, but if not, I guess we could end, and thank you all for participating. See, there are a couple of comments perhaps coming in, so thank you all very much.